My name is Price Harding, and I'm the chairman of the Trinity Forum. And we are so pleased to be able to host this event tonight with two such insightful speakers. The Trinity Forum started our evening conversation series really just a few years ago with just a small handful of people participating. What we wanted was to convene meetings where thoughtful professionals could engage the big questions of life from a faith perspective in an environment that prized both rigor and civility. We've now held evening conversations on topics ranging from poetry and beauty in a fallen world to religion and national security to science and faith. In addition to our evening conversation series, we hold forums around the world, including an annual forum for Rhodes and Marshall scholars to provide opportunities for reflection and engagement on these first principles. Tonight's evening conversation addresses one of those first principles in looking at how character is formed, reformed, and redeemed. I'm really glad so many of my Trinity Forum trustees are with us tonight. If you're one of the trustees, I would just like to welcome you and recognize you. If you could just stand wherever you are, and some of you may already be standing, but thank you very, very much for being here. Thank you very much. As chairman, I've been excited to see how Trinity Forum evening conversations have grown from those small gatherings to this much larger one. And I would encourage you to make sure that you're on our mailing list. I'd encourage you to keep up with what we're doing. And I'd encourage you to not let this be your last engagement with the Trinity Forum, but that you would join us as we bring other meetings of this nature to the city. In order to introduce tonight's topics and speakers, let me welcome to the platform the president of the Trinity Forum, Cherie Harder. Cherie?
Thank you, Price, for that introduction. And let me just add my welcome to all of you. We are so glad you're here tonight for tonight's evening conversation on the road to character. As you can tell, we are quite full tonight. We actually had to shut down registration early. So if you have friends who wanted to come this evening and were not able to, tonight's recording will be shown on C-SPAN. We'll also have a recording on our own website, which they are welcome to access. And if they want to add their own thoughts and questions to tonight's proceedings, they can do so either by joining us, our Twitter conversation at #TrinityForum, or our Facebook page. And we would just simply welcome their thoughts, comments, and input. I'd also like to acknowledge a few guests who are here tonight. We are delighted to have two different members of Congress, Congressman Jim Cooper from Tennessee and Adrian Smith from Nebraska. In addition, Price mentioned many of our trustees have flown in from all over the country: Price Harding, Byron Smith, Mike Brennan, George Clark, Kathy Wright, Doug Wilson, and Ed Meese. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm also delighted that our founder is here this evening, Oz Guinness, with his wife Jenny. So we're so glad to have you. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for discussion of life's greatest issues in the context of faith. And we do this by providing readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature and explore enduring questions and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as sponsoring programs such as this one tonight to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders and engaging those big questions of life, and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. It's been said that the great questions of life essentially boil down to just three. What is a good person? What is the good life? And what is a just society? Our speaker and his work will attempt to tackle all three tonight. the two of them the most directly. At a time when public interest in soulcraft, as well as the moral vocabulary used to describe it, has demonstrably dwindled, crowded out in part by the increased attention paid, particularly on the part of elites, in cultivating our brand, managing our image, and securing our own advancement. This new work makes a bracing counterargument that ultimately the good life lay not in achievement, acquisition, or status, but the development of a more and more integrated and virtuous character, what some might even call sanctification, aided by grace. And further, he argues that the road to character necessarily involves struggle, painful honesty, humility, and even suffering. The hallmark of a good life, by this reckoning, is what is said at one's funeral, not listed on one's resume. And while the upwardly striving resume achievements do bring some gratifications and certainly some pleasures, the arc of a well-lived life follows a U-shaped curve, including a cultivation of humility before one can see clearly, order one's priorities wisely, or experience a settled joy. It's a provocative, powerful, and countercultural argument, and it's hard to imagine a writer and thinker who can make it with more insight, eloquence, or aplomb than David Brooks. While David needs no introduction, he will get one anyway. David serves as an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, which he's done for over a dozen years, producing 2 columns every week, as well as a commentator on PBS's NewsHour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. He previously served as a police reporter for the City News Bureau, which was a wire service owned jointly by the Chicago Tribune and Sun-Times, a writer for the Washington Times, and a book review editor, reporter, and occasional movie critic, and later op-ed editor at the Wall Street Journal. He's also served as the senior editor of the Weekly Standard, as well as contributing editor for The Atlantic and Newsweek. A best-selling author, Brooks' books include Bobo's in Paradise, On Paradise Drive, and his third book, The Social Animal, The Hidden Sources of Love, Character, and Achievement, became a New York Times #1 bestseller. And of course, the work that he's discussing tonight is already #1 on the Amazon hardcover bestseller list. In addition to all of this, yeah, I think that merits it. David teaches at Yale University and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Responding to David tonight is Mike Gerson, a nationally syndicated columnist who appears twice weekly in the Washington Post, and the author of Heroic Conservatism, as well as co-author with Pete Weiner of City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. In addition, he serves as the senior advisor at ONE, a bipartisan organization dedicated to the fight against extreme poverty and preventable diseases, as well as a Hastert Fellow at the Denny Hastert Center for Economics, Government, and Public Policy at Wheaton. He previously served as a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and as a senior editor at U.S. News and World Report, as well as a top aide to President George W. Bush, both for policy and strategic planning, and as his chief speechwriter. At the conclusion of David's remarks, Mike will provide a response, and then we'll go to audience questions. David, welcome.
Thank you, Cherie. So about 10 years ago, I was driving home from work from the NewsHour, and it was a summer afternoon or evening, about 7 o'clock, summer evening. And I pulled into my house in Bethesda, and we had a driveway that went around the side. I pull in, and I could see the backyard. And my kids, who were then 12, 9, and 5, had gotten a hold of a ball, the kind of ball you buy at the Giant or the Safeway, one of those cheap round balls, and they were kicking it up in the air. And they were chasing it across the yard. And they were laughing and giggling. And the ball was arcing through the air, and the sun was coming down through the trees, and the grass looked strangely green for my yard. And so I pulled into the driveway, and I just saw them rolling on top of each other after a day of work, an unexpected, beautiful sight. And I just stared at them through the windshield for a few minutes. And it was one of those moments when life and time are suspended, and when reality spills outside its bounds, and you just get a sense of feeling of overwhelmed with gratitude. What did I do to deserve this? And you feel subsumed by a beauty that you haven't earned. And that sense of getting subsumed by a beauty that you haven't earned creates a strange desire, a strange stirring. It plows open hard ground, the normal ground of everyday life. It gives you a glimpse of a higher joy than you ever get in work. And then it exposes something deep inside you, and you want to be worthy of what you've been given. And so we all know the word for that undeserved gift. And you can get it around different people. I had at that moment, looking at my kids, I remember seeing prominent people or people that have an inner light. I was at the American Enterprise Institute last summer, and I happened to be seated next to the Dalai Lama at lunch. And he's a guy who radiates inner light. He laughs at unusual moments, and so he just starts laughing, and you want to be polite, so you laugh back. You do the laughing, and you feel comfortable with the guy. I remember I asked him, he had a little canvas Dalai Lama bag, and I said, "You got any candy in there?" And so he pulled out stuff in the bag, and basically it's everything you get in the first-class cabin of an airliner. So little earplugs, the blindfolds, a little razor, and then a big Toblerone bar. So he had that. But when you're around somebody like that with an inner light, you want to feel worthy of them, because there's a joy there. I was in Frederick, Maryland with my friend Charles Murray about a year ago, and I ran into some women who help immigrants learn to read. And it can take years to do this process. And when I walked in the room, about 30 women, aged 50 to 80, I guess, you just felt the wave of goodness coming off them, a glow of love and care, a laughter that was musical, voices that were settled and rooted. They made you feel valued and important. And again, a sense of just quietness and inner light. And you want to feel worthy of that. And if you have the sort of career success I've had, you think, well, I've done okay, but what they have, I don't have. I don't have that. And you want to be worthy of that. And when I come to the Trinity Forum, I experience a different sort of undeserved love. I have so many friends in this room who have not only exemplified certain ways of being in the world, but who have actively come and helped me in times of need, in times of vulnerability. Cherie, who leads the organization, Pete Wayner and Yuval Levin, Michael Cromarty, who've come forward at times of struggle and come with support and counsel. Stuart and Celia McAlpine hosted me in their homes, guided and laughed. April Lawson and Kristen Collins, who've younger in years, wiser in age. Ann Sluzar's close friend with her son Peter, somewhere out there. Jenny and Oz Guinness, who are lights to many of us. I see Barb Bradley over there. And so this is, to me, a bit of a coming home, but also a bit of feeling that these people have helped me more than I deserved. And when you're surrounded by that, you do feel like you want to live up to it. And the book is really a product of 5 years of that kind of searching. And the book starts with this distinction, which Cherie mentioned, between the resume and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues are the stuff we bring to the marketplace. The eulogy virtues are the things they say about us after we're dead. Whether we were brave, kind, courageous, what kind of relationships we built, whether we were capable of deep love. And we all know the eulogy virtues are more important, but in the daily life, especially in Washington, sometimes we place more emphasis on the resume, and we're clearer about how to build our career than we are on how to deserve a good eulogy. And that was certainly true of me. And a book that helped me think about it was a book by a guy named Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, which was written in 1965, called The Lonely Man of Faith. And Soloveitchik looked at Genesis and said there are two accounts of creation in Genesis which stand for the two sides of our nature, which he called Adam 1 and Adam 2. And Adam 1 is basically the resume Adam, the outward Adam that wants to build and create and develop things. And it's a noble Adam. Adam 2 is the internal Adam. Adam 2 wants to embody certain moral qualities, have a strong inner character that honors creation and one's own possibilities, have a solid sense of right and wrong, not only to do good, but to be good. Adam 1 wants to conquer the world. Adam 2 wants to obey a calling and serve the world. Adam 1 asks how things exist. Adam 2 asks why things exist and what ultimately we're here for. Adam 1 wants to venture forth. Adam 2 wants to be anchored. And Soloveitchik's point is that these two Adams sometimes live in confrontation with each other. And we do live in a culture that supports Adam 1 and sometimes ignores Adam 2. And I would add, and the people in this room understand, that Adam 1 and Adam 2 operate by a different logic. Adam 1 operates by an economic logic, which is straightforward. Input leads to output, effort leads to reward. Adam 2 lives by an inverse logic, which is a moral logic and not an economic one, and it's filled with inversions. You have to give to receive. You have to surrender something outside yourself to gain strength within yourself. You have to conquer your desire to get what you crave. Success can lead to the greatest failure, which is pride. Failure can lead to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, you have to forget yourself. In order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. And so Soloveitchik's point is you have to balance these two things. And we live in a culture where it's so competitive, where the noise of fast communication silences or drowns out the still silent voice inside. The meritocracy wants you to be big about yourself, promoting yourself, getting the next job opportunity. Social media wants you to be broadcasting yourself, creating a little highlight reel of your life. We have a philosophy that is prominent today that we have a little golden figure inside where we're naturally good, and we just need to trust that golden figure. And so the commencement speeches say, follow your passion, be true to yourself, trust yourself. We tell our kids how great they are all the time. In 1950, the Gallup organization had a poll question to high school students, are you a very important person? And in 1950, 12% of high school students said, yes, I'm a very important person. They asked the same question again in 2005, and it wasn't 12%, it was 80% who said I'm a very important person. They have a thing called narcissism tests where they ask people, I'm going to read a bunch of statements, does this apply to you? And they're statements like, I like to be the center of attention. I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. I like to look at my body. And the median narcissism score has gone up 30% in the last 20 years. Along with that has gone up an increased desire for fame. High school students were asked, would you rather be, or junior high school students were asked, would you rather be a celebrity's personal assistant, Justin Bieber's personal assistant, or president of Harvard? And of course, by 3-1, they'd rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she would rather be Justin Bieber. College students were asked, would they rather lead a life with a lot of fame or a lot of sex? And by 2-1, they chose the life of fame. And so I go to college campus and say, you know, I have a column in the New York Times, I'm on TV a couple times a week, I'm kind of famous. Go with the sex, it's better. Didn't know whether to tell that one, Sherry. But if you're only Adam 1, you turn into a shrewd animal. If that's all you have, you can lack a quality of inner depth. You are unable to speak with a sophisticated moral language. You live with an unconscious boredom, not really attached to things that are most important in life. And that's certainly been true at times of my life, that you receive the gifts of life can offer, but you settle for a sort of moral mediocrity. You grade yourself on a forgiving curve. You figure, people seem to like me, I'm not obviously hurting anybody, but a core piece of yourself is turning to a little less than you had originally hoped. A gap opens up between your actual self and your desired self. And so I spent 4 years trying to figure out that inner life, that sense of being unworthy of the gifts one has received. How do you get that inner life? How do you become a little more worthy? And a book can only give you so much. Reading and writing a book can't get you there, but it hopefully can provide a roadmap. I got an email from a guy named Dave Jolly, who's a veterinarian, who reminded me of this fact that it's only so much can be achieved in words. He wrote, what a wise person teaches is the smallest part of what they give. The totality of their life, of the way they go about it in their smallest details is what gets transmitted. Never forget that the message is the person, perfected over lifetimes of effort that was set in motion by yet another wise person, hidden from the recipient in the dim mists of time. Life is much bigger than we think, cause and effect, intertwined in a vast moral structure that keeps pushing us to do better, become better, even when we dwell in the most painful and confused darkness. The message of the person, what a wise man says, is the least of that which he gives. And so I was looking for people. I was looking for friends. I was looking for dead friends who left us a legacy of their lives to serve as examples of how to be better. One of those friends was a woman named Ida Eisenhower. She was born in 1862 in Shenandoah, Virginia. Her mom died when she was 5. Father died when she was 11. She became an indentured servant. And when her family was out for a picnic one day, she just split. She walked to Staunton, Virginia, got herself into high school, got her on a caravan train to Kansas, got herself through university, married a guy named David Eisenhower, and gave birth to 6 sons, one of whom was named Dwight Eisenhower. When Dwight Eisenhower was 9, he wanted to go out trick-or-treating. Ida said, "You're too young." Dwight Eisenhower had a temper tantrum right there in the front yard and punched the tree, and he punched it so bad he rubbed all the skin off his knuckles. Ida sent him to his room, had him cry for an hour, and came up to bind his wounds and recited a verse. "He that conquereth his own soul is greater than he who taketh a city." And many decades later, Eisenhower said that was the most important conversation of his life because it taught him that he had a weakness, a sin in himself that he needed to beat. And we think of him as this garrulous country club kind of guy. That was fake. He was a man of anger and tempestuousness. But he addressed his own sin and defeated his own sin over the course of his life. During World War II, at night he would lie awake, insomnia, anxiety, drinking, throat infections, spiking blood pressure. But he said, "I cannot let temper beat me." And he developed a whole series of strategies to defeat his sin. Some of them were stupid. He would take people he hated, he'd write their name on a piece of paper over and over again, rip it up and throw it in the garbage can. Thomas Burton wrote that souls are like athletes. They need opponents worthy of them if they are to be tried and extended and pushed to the full limits of their power. And what Ida and Dwight teach us is the importance of locating your core sin, identifying the activities to which it leads, the things which you're ashamed of, and defending and beating it, and understanding first that you do have a core sin. The second friend I acquired died longer before, Samuel Johnson. He was born in 1709 in England. He barely survived the ordeal of his birth. He was handed over to a wet nurse whose milk infected him with tuberculosis, rendering him blind in one eye, deaf in one ear. He developed smallpox, which left him scarred. They performed surgery on his jaw, which left scars all down his face. They opened his arm to bleed him and left the wound open for 6 years. He soon developed what we think is Tourette's syndrome and OCD. He was twisting and rolling about. He failed as a student. He failed as a teacher. His life at age 30 was what he called radically wretched. Suicide attempts. It was a very unsuccessful life. And out of that suffering, but he turned that suffering into something. The first thing suffering does, and it should be said there's nothing intrinsically noble about suffering, but as Paul Tillich wrote, what suffering does, it drags you deeper into yourself. It drags you beneath the daily cares of life and reminds you you're not who you thought you were. Tillich wrote that what suffering does, it carves into the basement of your soul and then carves through the floor, revealing a cavity below, carves through that floor, revealing a cavity below. And what suffering created in Johnson was a radical self-honesty. And we think of humility as thinking lowly of yourself, but my favorite definition of humility is radical self-awareness from a position of other-centeredness. Radical self-awareness from a distance. And Johnson achieved that. He walked to London and he started writing. And this is what Trinity Forum does. He wrote his way to goodness. He developed a firm understanding of the world just by taking each of his weaknesses and writing about them. He couldn't control his own body, but he needed to control his own mind by anchoring it in the reality of the truth. And so he wrote about sloth, he wrote about envy, he had a radical curiosity. If somebody told him there was a river in Oxford where people were drowning, he jumped right into the river to see what it was like. Somebody told him that if you stuck 2 balls in a musket and shoot it, it will explode. So he stuck 7 balls in and shot it against the wall. His subjects of his essays were the things that plagued him: sloth, envy, guilt, boredom, sorrow. And he just grabbed them each by the hand And over the course of that, as one biographer wrote, the iron entered his soul. He became from a scattered, disorganized person to a very stable and a very giving one. It created amazing work ethic in him. The French Academy took 40 scholars and 50 years to write the first French dictionary. Johnson did it alone with 6 clerks in 8 years. He would write for friends. A friend of his was given a lectureship at Oxford called the Blackstone Law Lectureship. Unfortunately, his friend knew no law. So Johnson said, I'll write the lectures for you. He wrote 1,600 pages of text for free for his friend. Between 68 and 72, he wrote The Lives of the Poet, 52 biographies containing 378,000 words. This hunger to express. He had a great social club, Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, but he also at his home kept in strays. People who had nowhere else to go, former prostitutes, slaves, a doctor with no money, 10, 13 people living with him at a time. And there was a largeness to him, a generosity of spirit. And that was all created out of intellectual honesty. And so when he died, one of his colleagues wrote, he has made a chasm which not only nothing can fill up, but which nothing has a tendency to fill up. Johnson is dead, let us go with the next best. There is nobody. No man can said to be put you in mind of Johnson. So from Johnson, we learn how to turn suffering into self-understanding and the importance of radical curiosity and the intellectual effort and the way intellectual effort can lead to actually moral goodness. The third friend I met is a woman named Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day, as many of you know, was the sort of person who couldn't just read a novel. She inhabited the novel and became like the characters of the novel. And unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. And so she took to drinking, carousing, living in poverty, sleeping around, a couple of abortions, 1 or 2 suicide attempts, a very disorganized life. She was arrested, wrongfully arrested, but she took her arrest as an indictment, as a judgment on her own disorganized life. Amazing capacity for self-criticism. She couldn't get out of it, though. But she had a child out of wedlock, and she decided that all the accounts of childbirth she had ever read were written by men. So she decided she would write one. She wrote one 40 minutes after giving birth. And it's very dramatic. But it climaxes with a beautiful scene. She wrote, if I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, painted the most beautiful painting, or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I often felt after the birth of my child. And with this came the need to worship and to adore. And again, unmerited love. That worship, that adoration, my friend Christian Wyman says, when you have love, love is always in motion. It went to her child, but then it spread outward. She became a Catholic. She formed the Catholic Worker. She formed communes, homeless shelters, not only serving the poor, but living with the poor, embracing poverty. And it was a love that bled out into community. And her example teaches us the value of self-criticism and also the value of love in the service of community. And so these are all some of the friends that you learn from. The fourth one I'd mention is the great novelist George Eliot. Like the others, she had a very bad childhood. She was the sort of person, she didn't get much love from her mother, and therefore she was emotionally needy. She fell in love with every guy she encountered, married or not, available or not, 70 years old, 15 years old. She just needed love. She fell in love eventually with a guy named Herbert Spencer, who was her intellectual equal. And in 1852, at age 32, she wrote him a letter which was at once pathetic but also impressive and a bit of a turning point. The pathetic part was she's begging him to marry her. It's like, don't worry, you won't even notice me, I won't be around. But at the end, she finishes with a flourish. And she says, I suppose no woman ever before wrote such a letter as this, but I am not ashamed, for I am conscious in the light of reason and true refinement that I am worthy of your respect and tenderness, whatever gross men and vulgar-minded women might think of me, worthy of respect. And there comes a certain point in people's lives where people don't need the affirmation from outside or criticism. They develop an internal criteria of right and wrong, and she had achieved that, what you might call an agency moment. She didn't work out with Spencer, but she met a guy named George Lewes, who was also a writer, who was legally married, though his wife was estranged, living with another man, having 3 children with another man. She fell in love with Lewes, but it was Victorian era, there was no divorce possible. If she had gone with Lewes, she would be labeled an adulteress, and she would lose all her friends. And she'd decide, am I going to face social ostracism, or am I going to go with Lewes? Took her about a week. She wrote, I have counted the cost of the step that I have taken. I am prepared to bear without irritation or bitterness, renunciation by all my friends. I am not mistaken in the person to whom I have attached myself. He is worthy of the sacrifice I have incurred. My only anxiety is that he should be rightly judged. And so what Eliot teaches us is the power of love to improve us morally. First, it humbles us. It reminds us we're not in control of our own mind. Love is an invading army that we want to be conquered by. Second thing, plows open hard ground, opens those soft parts of our character. Third, it decenters the self. It reminds us our riches are not in ourselves, but in another. Fourth, it eliminates the distinction between giving and receiving. Fifth, it makes us poetical. And that's the idealistic, early romanticized love, the kind that Taylor Swift sings about. Eliot had that, but she had what you might call a second love. The second love is the kind that goes to older people who've been scarred by life, who are enmeshed in responsibilities, and whose love is not as poetic, it's more realistic, and it's more local. It's about knowing your own weaknesses and knowing your partner's weaknesses. My friend Leon Wieseltier described this kind of love in a wedding toast. This kind of second love, he wrote, is private and it is particular. Its object is the specificity of this man and that woman, the distinctiveness of this spirit and that flesh. This love prefers deep to wide and here to there, the grasp to the reach. When the day is done, the lights are out, there is only this other heart, this other mind, this other face, to assist in repelling one's demons or in greeting one's angels. It does not matter who the president is. When one consents to marry, one consents to be truly known, which is an ominous prospect. And so one bets on love to correct for the ordinariness of the impression and to call forth the forgiveness that will be required. Marriages are exposures. We may be heroes to our spouses, but we may not be idols. It's a very beautiful passage. They stayed together for years. Lewes suggested to Eliot that she write fiction. Maybe you'll be good at it. She comes back a week later with a short story. He starts crying. He realizes her talent. And in some way, his love is the superior because the rest of his life, he, a writer, subsumes himself to her superior ability. He becomes her agent, her publicist, her editor, her counselor. She's sensitive to criticism, like all of us. And so he gets up early in the morning, cuts out the newspaper articles that mention her, so she won't have to read them. And so in that way, love becomes a moral occasion. And so these are some of the things that lead to depth of character, some of the activities that lead to depth of character. And I think to get them, you have to step outside the culture that says you have a golden figure inside, the culture of the big me that celebrates the self. You have to embrace an alternative culture, a culture that many of us in this room are familiar with, that says, one, we don't live for happiness, we're endowed with moral imaginations, we live for holiness and goodness. We're willing to struggle if we can get that. Two, we're divided creatures, both deeply broken and splendidly endowed. Three, the struggle against our own weakness and sin is the central drama of life, not the external struggle for success. Four, in this struggle, humility is the greatest virtue. In this struggle, pride is the daily vice. Pride blinds you to your own weakness. Character is built over your confrontation with yourself. No person can achieve self-mastery on their own. We all require redemptive assistance from outside, from friends, from family, from institutions, and from God. In the course of this book, I came in thinking the character was this little iron figure inside, this little figure of self-discipline, like the Victorian view. But then I realized nobody can do it outside, that character is really the strength of your commitments to things outside. That a person of character has a settled philosophy about fundamental things, is enmeshed in a web of unconditional loves, and is committed to tasks that can't be completed in a lifetime. And so these friends, they're dead friends. To me, they're like the kind of people on the wall, who are company, who are standards, who are inspirations. And as I say, writing a book doesn't make you better, but they give you a model. And the reward is some moments, what you see, what I saw in those ladies in Frederick, moments of tranquility and joy. Adam 1 is never tired. He never stops. There's always another ambition out there. But Adam 2 does experience moments of tranquility and joy. I mentioned Dorothy Day earlier, one of my favorite examples for her. And she was a woman who struggled and suffered a lot, maybe too much. But at the end of her life, she was asked by Robert Coles, the Harvard sociologist, if she'd ever thought of written a memoir. It would have been a natural thing. She was a great writer. She wrote throughout her life. And she said, you know, I sat down one day near the end of my life, and I wrote on a piece of paper, a life remembered. And I thought of how to describe my life, and I thought back over the key moments of my life. And then she said, and I thought of my life, my moments, and I thought of the Lord and his visits to us those many centuries ago, and I was just grateful to have had him on my mind all that time. And that's that feeling of gratitude and peace when Adam 1 lays down before Adam 2. The final friend I'll mention is the greatest of them, which is Augustine. He was born in Algeria in 354. He had a mom, most of you know, named Monica, who was the helicopter mom to beat all helicopter moms. She had a devouring love for her son. She wanted to control who he married, what kind of Christian he was, where he lived. When he left Africa to go to Italy, she screamed at the shore, at the boat as it was sailing away. She snuck back, she found him, she followed him. He became a Manichae, she excommunicated him, she brought him back. She was all over him. But at a certain point, he became the kind of Christian she wanted and the kind of man she wanted. And they were heading back to Africa, and she said to him, you know, all my life, she was about 56, I've wanted you to be a certain sort of man, a certain sort of Christian, and you are that. And she eventually said, you know, my life here is more or less done. I thought I wanted to die in Africa, but God's everywhere, I don't care. And so they had a conversation which Augustine describes in a garden. And he writes that after all that conflict, all those years, he writes that they experienced, quote, the very highest delight of the earthly senses, in the purest material of the light, in respect of the sweetness of that light. They did by degrees pass through all things bodily, even the very heaven, when sun and moon and stars shine upon the earth. From material things we came to our own minds and went beyond them. And then he has a long sentence that's very hard to parse. I've read it many, many times. I can't understand what it is. But he has a word replicated through the sentence. And that word is hushed. He says the sound of the birds were hushed, the sound of the trees were hushed, the sound of the air was hushed, the sound of our voices was hushed, the sound of our hearts were hushed. And you just get this sense of silence and peace and tranquility. And that's something we're all looking for, and that's the reward at the end of the road to depth. And so I've introduced you to these friends, and I guarantee you just doing the book isn't enough. Just writing it, just reading it doesn't make you better. But it does point a path, and it points to path to each other, a way of stumbling forward together to each other, going home at night thinking, what are my chief sins? How did I do today on them? Who can I rely on? Who can I trust? And ultimately, who can I surround myself with who loves me more than I deserve? So thanks very much.
In The Road to Character, David Brooks wonders if a life of achievement has really resulted in human excellence, worries about turning into something less impressive than he hoped, muses on the eulogy virtues, and right, he says, to save his soul. The technical literary term for this is a midlife crisis. Most of us just buy a convertible. David typically has produced a book that could be an important cultural turning point, a book that seems not just a composition, but a culmination of something important. A work this rich defies easy summary. Part of the book is an exercise in cultural criticism, expressed through the creative choice of biographical examples. David prefers what he calls heroes of renunciation, a diverse group consisting of men and women, minorities and whites, gay people and straight, aristocratic and blue collar, generally shaped by tragedy and driven to make unsparing demands on themselves. They stand in contrast to ascendant forms of self-trust, self-love, self-expression, self-esteem, and self-actualization. The choice is clear. I have set before you Unitas and Namath. Therefore, choose Unitas, that you and your descendants may live. Or maybe it's not quite so clear. As David recognizes, American character is a composite, an alloy of moral realism and moral romanticism. Eisenhower is a national type, but so are Patton and MacArthur. Even Joe DiMaggio, after all, married Marilyn Monroe. Our current problem is a massive overcorrection, the advance of careerism, consumerism, and Woodstock expressiveness at the expense of the inner struggle and the inner life. The literary achievement of The Road to Character is inseparable from the virtues of its author. As the reader, you not only want to know about Francis Perkins or St. Augustine, you want to know what David makes of Francis Perkins or St. Augustine. The voice of the book is so calm and fair and humane. The highlight of the material is the quality of the author's moral and spiritual judgments. Across the pages, David is such a reliable guide, such a pleasant companion. And the book is rich in memorable epigram. Egotism is the ravenous hunger in a small space. Humility is the awareness that you are the underdog in the struggle against your own weakness. St. Augustine of Hippo, it turns out, was history's most high-maintenance boyfriend. My copy of the book is maniacally underlined, starred, and dog-eared out of admiration and envy. While containing cultural criticism, The Road to Character can't be reduced to it, precisely because David doesn't take our communal struggle to be primary. Like Frederick Buechner, he finds the greatest drama in our sacred journeys, the saving and losing of souls, including our own. This demands a return to the moral vocabulary of a previous era, still half remembered and powerful, a consciousness of sin, a real determination to reach holiness, a recognition that we are most spiritually free when we are bound in a calling. It's amazing how dangerous and countercultural it is to say these words aloud. David is the perfect modern translator of these ideas because he is constitutionally incapable of finger-wagging. His is a call to a cheerful, tolerant, shared struggle with sin. Thomas à Kempis said, "Be not angry that you cannot make others as you wish them to be, since you cannot make yourself as you wish to be." Humility is the beginning of holiness and the destination as well. David describes a type of spiritual maturity that I've occasionally glimpsed, sometimes in an African village, sometimes in an urban ministry, sometimes in a classroom or a pew. These examples, though very different, have a similar feel, a graciousness, a steadiness, a gentleness, a concentrated sense of purpose, the stillness of a wise trust. To be honest, these portions of David's book were not pleasant for me to read. His description of maturity, of the centered, grounded life, sometimes made the book feel hot in my hand. It is difficult to fairly review something so convicting. There is a very real abyss that looms in middle age, when your alarm clock sounds more like the cock crowing 3 times, when you look in the mirror and Prufrock stares back. There can be so much anxiety and dryness, craving and clutching, pessimism and pride, and that's just in finally buying a gym membership. Put another way, if David's 15-point humility code were a BuzzFeed quiz, I would have abandoned it before completion, fearing what my score would be. I suspect that many of us would. If the book had stopped there, I would have secretly hated it, like a cancer patient hates a CAT scan. Too much accuracy, too much resolution. But I'm grateful that the book did not stop there. We are ultimately saved by grace, says David, right there in thesis number 10. It may come in the form of love from friends and family, in the assistance of an unexpected stranger, or from God, but the message is the same. You are accepted. You don't flail about in desperation because hands are holding you up. You don't have to struggle for a place because you are embraced and accepted. David makes this point in a non-sectarian, even non-religious manner. He is always careful, always courteous to leave people the space to find their own way. But this is not a viewpoint that comes out of the classical tradition or out of Victorian morality. It is an inherently theological contention, a rescue that originates from the outside. The scales of the universe, in the end, come down decisively on the side of love. And we experience it, not like the argument in a book, but like a smile on a beloved's face. Instead of finding, we are found. Perhaps the most amazing thing about grace is that all our sins, our failures, our losses, and our mediocrity are merely the preface to a story that can begin even in middle age, even at any age. Grace, according to Simon Tugwell, means that wherever we have got to, whatever we have done, that is precisely where the road to heaven begins. However many wrong turns we have taken, however unnecessarily we may have complicated our journey, the road still beckons and the Lord still waits to be gracious to us. By carrying a part of this hope, David's book is a means of grace. Let me close with one observation. David is a vulnerable presence in the book, which allows us to be vulnerable readers. He would never in a million years elevate himself as one of the models of humility and inner struggle he praises, but he is to me. I've gotten to know David over the years, first as an admirer, then as an occasional dinner companion. He's an example of humane wisdom. He wears great learning lightly. He has an extraordinary talent for friendship. And one reason this book will be so influential is because he is so admirable. David quotes Dr. Johnson saying, "It is always the writer's duty to make the world better." David would achieve that goal without writing a word. But I'm grateful that he has produced The Road to Character. Thank you.
We've come to the conversation part of our evening conversation, where David and Mike will take questions from the audience. There are just 3 rules to question time. 1, to be brief, be civil, and of course, ask a question in the form of a question. On both sides of the audience, there will be people with mics. If you could just wait for me to call on you and to receive the mic so we can actually get this recorded, that would be great. Questions from the audience. Right here.
David, the Christian apologist C.S. Lewis, who's quoted in your book, said that those who seriously and constantly seek joy will never fail to miss it. Would you tell us if that resonates with you in relation to the journey that you're on?
I guess the distinction we made is between happiness and joy. And so we have a culture organized around happiness, more or less. And that is usually defined in the social science literature by how are you feeling right now? Like people, you get called up, are you happy? Are you in a good mood? And it's produced some valuable teachings, that literature. The first is that money doesn't correlate that well with happiness. It does to about $75,000 a year, and then it levels off. The second is that age correlates a bit to happiness. People are pretty happy in their 20s. And then happiness begins to drip down, and it bottoms out at age 47, which is called having teenage children. And then it rises up in the 60s. And people's happiest years are the 10 years after retirement. And so I think that's useful to know. But I've never actually met anybody who lived for happiness, or almost never. I shouldn't say that. I was in Vegas over the weekend, so I have met a lot of people. But most people want struggle. And they want, you can use it in a religious term or not, they want holiness. They want to feel their life has some significance, and they're willing to endure a lot of struggle for that. Now, Lewis's definition of joy is a very paradoxical one and instructive. It's not always the crimson and the trumpets. His definition of joy is that, I don't know, Michael will know it better, the people in this room will know it better, but is that sense of searching. What Dorothy Day, she has a phrase, she wrote a beautiful book called The Long Loneliness. Loneliness for her was not only solitude, it was searching, it was spiritual ambition. And so most of us are happiest, I think, when we have a sense that we are in the searching, and we're willing to struggle, we're willing to endure unhappiness to feel that sense of fulfilled, feeling of surroundedness. I feel like, Michael, I've done injustice.
No, Lewis also talked about being surprised by joy, which was his autobiography. Maybe not something you can seek, but that comes in other pursuits. It's one thing about the spiritual life that's always impressed me with people I respect in this way is the single-mindedness of it. You talked about the pursuit of joy, the pursuit of God, the pursuit of holiness. Kierkegaard, I think, talked about the courage to will one thing, the perseverance to will one thing. That, I think, is another characteristic, just the focus.
Other questions? In the back there, Stuart.
So this is a political town, and you are both political thinkers. And I want to explore how the book and the philosophy in the book can maybe help address what a lot of us in this town, and probably in this room, thinks a pretty broken political system, a very divided society, wealth redistribution over the last 30 years, and red and blue and all this stuff, and poverty rates, all the things that we hear about in the public discourse. And maybe that's not what your book is about at all, but it's given that you think about politics all the time, how can the thinking you espouse in your book help us recenter, reframe, get us back to a politics and governance that will allow the country to move forward more purposefully and so forth?
Well, I keep a list of 5 people in Washington who I think exemplify the highest virtues and to renew faith in Washington, just in case you get depressed. And there are people like Anthony Weiner and I guess a couple things leap to mind. First is I would defend the space that's non-political. Johnson, I'm going to mangle this, but he had a quote, he had a couplet, "Of all the things that human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause and cure." Meaning that a lot of our life in the level of relationships and faith and in friendship and community, it's more foundational than politics. Nonetheless, I do think the shift in culture has affected politics in 2 ways. First, as we become, I think, a more proud culture, and it should be said we should not be nostalgic, we should not want to go back to the 40s and 50s. We were a more racist culture, sexist culture. Fathers in particular were emotionally cold toward their children. They didn't know how to express emotion. The food was awful. But in this one way, I do think the culture was healthier in the sense of self, in the smaller sense of self. People weren't bragging about their colleges on their window stickers in the back of their car and what vacation destination they went to. that would have been considered getting too big for your britches. And I do think a couple things benefit from that. If you have a large sense of self and you think you control the truth, then the people who disagree with you are just in the way, and you're going to be a polarizing figure. If you think of most of politics as the competition between half-truths, you're going to be a little more humble about the disagreement, because you're going to realize your opponents have a piece of the truth yourself. And I think the rise of egotism has contributed to polarization. It's also contributed to an inarticulateness about moral things. We have these things called Google Ngrams, where you can track what words are in usage across magazines, newspapers, books. The number of economic words have gone up. The usage of moral words has gone down. So over the last 30 years, usage of the words like kindness, humbleness, honor, bravery are down about 55%. And so we're just less articulate about it. I don't think we're worse off, we're just less articulate. And I think that's had a denuding effect on the public square. And then the final thing to be said is the character of the politicians. We all are in businesses that have character challenges. We're pundits, we broadcast ourselves all the time. It's hard to get out of that unscathed. But politicians, you know, they are their own product, and we've got a couple in the room, and Jim Cooper was here somewhere, I didn't see him, but someone I really, really admire, a man of great intellectual honesty. But you know, every meeting is about themselves. Everything is about themselves. I interviewed somebody in the Obama administration, and while the interview was going on, the president left the front lawn to go on the helicopter, or whatever lawn that is, the back lawn. And the guy interrupted the interview just so he could stand out the window and see the president's back as he went into the helicopter. He was so much in love, he just wanted to see his back. And can you imagine being surrounded by that all day? And so what I find is most challenging is the lack, what gets corroded is an internal voice which says the truth. You have an external voice which says what you have to say for the party, but then do you have an internal honest views? Abraham Lincoln had an aide named John Hay who wrote these diaries during the war. And he was writing these press releases about the war, and it was like, we're going great, General Meade is a hero, a genius. And then in his diary, we're losing, General Meade, such an idiot. It's like, but to have that internal voice, that gets bleached away if you're all external. And I think that's a gigantic character challenges that our politicians face.
I would only add there are two forms of humility that you should look for in the book. There's a humility, if I'm describing it correctly, that's based on sin, the democratic nature of sin. We struggle with it together. We struggle in community. It makes it impossible to have a sense of superiority if you're Augustinian in this. But you also talk in the book about a humility based on limitations, on an epistemological humility, based on what we can know, and a predisposition to, I think you say, make mistakes slowly. Okay? So I think that humility does have social and political consequences. These things just are not contained in the private realm. And they lead, I think, in a kind of conservative direction, a sort of Burkean direction, towards the politics of repair rather than the politics of destruction and recreation. At any rate, those, I think, are some interesting themes in the book when it comes to the public implications.
In the back.
I'd be interested in both of your perspectives on what I suspect you believe is the unwarranted rise of narcissism. What do you think has really triggered this?
Newspaper columnists. We're a humble breed. You know, in my view, there are some things that triggered it. Some of them were legitimate, by the way. Up until the 1950s and 60s and 70s, large members of the population had been thought to think too little of themselves, notably minorities and women. And so there had to be a rise of self-esteem to help those people. In the book, I summarize a beautiful book by Katharine Graham. And she's a person who early in life had been taught to think nothing of herself. And only through the course of hardship, her husband's suicide, her taking over the Washington Post, did she learn her own capabilities. But to me, the big thing, I thought it was all the 60s in American conservatism, we're told to blame everything on the 60s. But to me, the shift happened in the 1940s. Basically, the country had been through the Depression, the war, 16 years of repression, restraint, and they just said, to heck with it. We're going to let loose. And so consumerism shot up, advertising shot up, Mad Men era. But the big shift was they'd seen World War II and the horrors, and they said, we're going to turn the page on human nature. And they wanted to do away with sin. And so there was a book by a guy named Rabbi Joshua Liebman that came out and said, I'm going to write a new 10 Commandments, not thou shalt not, but thou shalt. Thou shalt love thyself. Thou shalt honor thyself. And that was the number one on the bestseller list for 56 weeks. Another book came out called The Mature Mind, said the same thing, on the bestseller list for something like 28 weeks. Dr. Spock came out with his baby manual. It said, if your child steals something, give him what he stole, and taught him he can get what he wants, he can trust his desires, but he just has to ask for it. I'd say that's a relatively upbeat view of human nature. And then The Power of Positive Thinking comes out, and then a guy named Carl Rogers comes out with Humanistic Psychology, says you're really good inside, everything bad is outside. And so there was a philosophical shift that happened, and it wasn't the boomers, and it wasn't Woodstock, it was the greatest generation.
Anything to add?
No.
Other questions? Right back here. Why don't you go ahead and stand up, make it easier for him to find you.
David, so much of what you write about is steeped in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Were there times in this journey where you felt like actually the Judeo-Christian tradition didn't have the framework that you needed to articulate what you were seeing, feeling, thinking?
Yeah, you have to understand, I was raised in a certain sort of household, which was, my parents were academics. I knew I wanted to be a writer at age 7. And the joke I tell is in high school, I wanted to date this girl named Bernice. She didn't want to date me. She dated another guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So I was steeped in that. And then the admissions directors at Brown and Columbia and Wesleyan decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which is, I was mentioning to somebody, the crude saying about Chicago is where fun goes to die, but the better saying is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so when I got there, some of the old refugees of World War II were still there. German professors, and the first 2 years were great books. And when those professors saw us and approached us with those books, they said, these books have the key to the truth. Aristotle, Hobbes, the Bible, Shakespeare, Proust. This is the magic key. And I don't know if anybody communicates that to students, but it was communicated to me, and those first 2 years were so powerful. And so there are ideas out, and part of that is the biblical metaphysic. It's unclear what sort of language or what sort of religion Abraham Lincoln had, but he grew up with the King James Bible and had the vocabulary of it. And so that's what I know, and that's what I believe in. And so everything I know is within that tradition. I just don't know Asian traditions. I don't know Buddhism. And if there are limits to that tradition of questions that can't be answered within it, I'm not aware of them.
It's interesting that the sources of that tradition are countercultural now. It'd be interesting to see where they emerge. Whether it's, Christian education has an important role in this, how parents inculcate this, what sources of input they have to engage in a countercultural message. I had a different academic experience going to Wheaton College. The joke there was that the administration had banned premarital sex because it might lead to dancing. And that's, I found it to be, I studied theology at Wheaton College, and it was a decision my parents didn't really understand as far as the economics of studying theology in college. But it was a place to get some things settled. And I'm not sure how much of our educational process is now oriented towards getting some things settled. So if these have to come from somewhere, and fortunately, they're now coming on the New York Times bestseller list as well.
Can I say one thing about Wheaton? I gave this, when I was writing the book, I went to a lot of schools and divinity schools and such places and presented it to get feedback. And by far the best session I had was with 7 professors at Wheaton. And I've met a lot of Wheaties since, usually in bars late at night. Clubs in lower Manhattan, the Wheaties are out of control. But I've always sensed a strange simpatico. Obviously, Wheaton's Christian School of Chicago is I don't know what kind of school it is, a celibate school. But I don't know. We were involuntarily, you were done it out of conviction. Okay, I'm going off the rails. But there was an intellectual earnestness to both places. And not all schools celebrate that. And having those two years at Chicago, especially the first 2, and I think for Wheaton, you can always tell a Wheaton grad. You can always tell a Chicago grad. And different schools, Kenyon, there are a lot of schools that leave a mark, and I can pick people out.
Jeff, right here. Why don't you stand up, so Stuart.
Your message seems
Wait for the
to be
mic.
one that's so much driven by age. I mean, it seems like
Wait for the mic.
your message seems to be a little bit driven by the age, that it would be receptive to the crowd that I see around here. 50-year-old, 40-year-old people. Sorry, okay, 70-year-old people, whatever. How would you see that reflected in young people? Do you get a receptive message? And if they did receive it, if all the young congressmen received it, how do you think that would change?
First, let me, when Mike was talking about the midlife, the things that happen in midlife, I was thinking, who are you calling weak, Kimosabe? I'm young. I'm aging backwards here. I'm vigorous. I don't particularly think this book was a middle age. Maybe it was unconsciously. And I teach at Yale. I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. And my students are hungry for it. And I've detected no variation up and down the age range. My students have been raised in a certain way to strive. To get into Yale is a horribly difficult thing to do. And they've been working, and founding companies and curing fatal diseases. And, I asked them, what are you doing in spring break? And, I'm unicycling across Thailand while reading to lepers. They're perfect. And yet, they have not been given a moral vocabulary. And they're completely aware of that. And one of my students said to me over coffee a little while ago, we're so hungry, we're so hungry. And so I do not think there's any age difference. I don't think there's any education difference. I just spoke to 16,000 people who sell cosmetics, and I don't know what their education levels, but probably different than this room. No difference. No difference in how you have to phrase it, how you have to understand it. I don't think there's an income difference. Sometimes I get, there's a first world problem, you're affluent, you have the luxury to think about these things. Well, the churches and the synagogues and mosques are filled with people without much means who are completely as serious about all this as any of the rest of us. Everyone has a moral imagination, the urge to do this. So I just don't think that it aligns by demographic category.
I agree with that, and I spent some time on campuses as well, at Wheaton, Duke, some other places. And my main concern, however, there's a huge amount of idealism and a deep distrust in institutions, a deep distrust in politics as an outlet for idealism. And it's interesting that many of the people that you profile in the book are institutionalists. They're not traditionalists. Sometimes they're very oriented towards radical change, but for the sake of working institutions, which is a very American kind of approach. that I think is a little bit of a generational disconnect. There are plenty of people that want to teach for America. They want to do Peace Corps. They want to do other things. But if you ask them their view of social justice or their view of political engagement, it's much lower. And it really is a shame. I mean, I've made the point before, but it is, there are a lot of urgent issues out there. And if you think politics is not important, it means that you're comfortable. It means you don't have need for justice right at that moment, but other people do. And so I think a little of that urgency about the need to transform institutions, make them into instruments of idealism is probably a gap. So.
We're going to take 2 more questions. We'll take far right over there.
Question primarily for David. You mentioned Charles Murray at the outset of your talk and the thing about elites. Just wondering, in a city like this one, with a lot of people who are prioritizing Atom 1, if you might have sort of a best piece of advice for people in their 20s, people in their 30s, for sort of being overtaken by Atom 2. And maybe it's coming to a group like this one, but it's still elite. And I wonder if you might comment on the importance of moving beyond mere association with elites and bubbles as part of that journey.
Yeah, well, I do think it's important to move out, go out to outside of bubbles. I every summer I try to get out of the DC bubble. I go to Aspen, Colorado. Want to get in touch with the real America. And it seems fine, by the way. It seems fine. Well, a couple things leap to mind. The first thing is obviously getting outside the bubble is valuable, and having cross-class experiences is valuable. I had a quiz in one of my books, which Charles borrowed. No, he's good. With full citation, can you name, if you look at a military uniform, can you name the ranks on the sleeve? Do you know what oats look like growing in the grass? Can you name NASCAR drivers? There are certain cultural literacy tests that those in Washington should have to pass, just to know. And so that's one thing. But I think a good life can be led here and a bad life can be led elsewhere. One of the things that I do think is wrong is my college students, they have 2 set career paths. The one path is the noble but poor teach for America path. The other path is the Goldman Sachs rich sellout, soulless affluence path. And I try to tell them there are many more paths. But second, there are a lot of really horrible people in the NGO TFA world and a lot of really good people in the finance world. It doesn't matter what world you're in, it matters how you live your life. And so are you always prioritizing Atom 1 or Atom 2? I have a friend who hires a lot of people, and I asked him, what question do you ask the job interviewers in every job interview? He says, I have one question that I think is crucial. I say, name a time you told the truth and it hurt you. And so I tell my students, if you can fake that one, you'll be okay. Because that's a question of, is there an attitude moment that comes immediately to mind? And do you live a life of internal drama? And you can do that in a hedge fund. It's not been known to happen, but no, I'm just kidding. And you can do that in an NGO. And so it's whether you're living life as a moral occasion, whether you're spending your life reading books, whether you're reading C.S. Lewis or Joseph Soloveitchik, whether you're surrounding yourself with the sort of friends, whether you're keeping a journal. I've become much more of a fan of journaling, and doing self-criticism and self-awareness, and whether you're having a discussion group. What is suffering good for? What is love good for? What are the challenges we're facing in our lives? All those are daily activities that you can do just as well whether you're living in, Georgetown or on the other side of the moral universe, Chevy Chase.
Mike, anything to add? Oh, gosh, so many hands up. You know, we'll do 2 more questions. Right in the back there.
Growing up in Baltimore and attending Orthodox Hebrew school, a few days before my bar mitzvah, I began my sad departure from Judaism. I did come to Christ about 20 years later. After a couple years, I came to realize that if God expects me to do good deeds, then how can doing a good deed, what modern Judaism promotes, that is expected of me anyway, how can that make up for my sins? And I was not yet familiar with Isaiah 64, that God doesn't approve of. Our good deeds are not how good God says they are. It seems to me that along your journey, you have picked up many of the pieces needed for finding true transcendent truth. In Judaism today, God favors is earned by mitzvah, good works. How might this thought fit or not fit into your journey to find the answers to life?
It should be pointed out I grew up in Severstown in New York, and I went to a school called Grace Church School, where I was part of the all-Jewish boys davening choir. And so we would sing, but there was about 30% Jewish, and to square it with our religion, we wouldn't sing the word Jesus. And so the volume would drop in the hymns. But I would say in the intertwining of these 2 faiths, the question of agency and grace are the crucial ones. And how much can you get there on your own, and how much do you require an act of surrender? And I confess this is a question that's unsettled in my mind. I was raised in an achievement culture with the belief you can earn your way. At some point, it occurs to you, you have to raise the white flag of surrender and surrender your way. And I'm unclear. I don't have an answer to that.
Okay, last question. Mary, if you could stand so the mic guy can see you.
A term that you both used tonight, David, mostly you, is the term holiness. And so I just want to know, what do you understand holiness to be, and how do you live that out in your life?
So the definition of a brain surgeon is someone who studies brain chemistry for about 20 minutes and then goes to a conference of brain surgeons and tells them how to do their job. I feel a little like that now, because I know a lot of the people in this room have been reading these works for not centuries, you're not that old. But for a lot longer and a lot better than I. And it's actually always a challenge to me when I'm speaking about such topics. When I go to secular audiences and I mention some of it, like I crib something from Augustine or Niebuhr, people treat it like, wow, that's so cool. And I go to a Christian school, and it's like, yeah, so what? We read that 15 years ago. I'd have to totally up my game. So I feel a little overmatched by the audience in this regard. I guess I use my book is not a religious book. It uses religious categories, but it is meant to address all audiences, those who have faith and those who don't. And I do that because I think the public square needs to have these words reintroduced. And frankly, in a non-sectarian manner. And there was a time when we had Abraham Joshua Heschel and Reinhold Niebuhr and public theologians in the square who were talking about these things and were getting a wide readership. We have very little of that today. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs is rabbi in the public square, Tim Keller, Oz, who's here, but very little, and I think the public square is denuded. And so I wander, I want to be in the public square. I write for the New York Times. I'm a secular writer. I'm a conservative of the New York Times, a job I liken to being chief rabbi at Mecca. And so I use the word holiness in 2 ways. The first way is to suggest a moral joy. And I would say that thing I opened with at my speech about seeing my kids, there was something holy about that moment. Illuminant, that's not a word, luminescent. But there's also a holiness when you go through, when you're in Jerusalem, for example. Christians don't do enough of visiting Jerusalem, by the way. I'm always amazed by how many have not been there. And you walk the stations of the cross. And in each of the stations, there's a little chapel from Orthodox or whatever. And there's always there's different artwork on the walls from the different moments. But there's a similar face in each of them. And it's a face of humility and simplicity and joy and radiance and quietness. It's the face of the Beatitudes. And there's something holy about that face. And that's a more explicitly religious holiness. But I try to use the word, I think it can exist on two levels.
It's also just an intimidating term for me, because it's possible in the spiritual life sometimes to show courage when you do something, a point of decision. But holiness, when you meet really holy people, it is a long obedience in the same direction. It's a set of habits that are developed again and again. It's very much like the rewiring of your own mind in some way. And that can't be done in a moment. It really, a man's habits become his character. I guess that's Aristotle. But it's the most intimidating of the Christian virtues in a certain way for me, because it's the work of a lifetime. And when you do meet people in that category, there is a kind of radiance. So I agree.
David, Michael, thank you so much.